Welcome to a very unique episode of Gospel Bound. My name is Jim Davis, pastor of Orlando Grace Church and host of the As in Heaven podcast here at TGC. And I am joined today by a first-time guest, Colin Hanson, Vice President of Content and Chief Editor of the Gospel Coalition. Colin, thank you for joining us.
This is a little weird, Jim, but I'm glad to be here.
To make it a little weirder, I'll tell you, we're in full emergency mode here in not so sunny Orlando. We have storms and thunder and tornadoes. So if you hear a little rain or falling trees, that's what's going on here. Well, as many of your listeners really know, this is Colin's podcast where he is normally the host, but today we are trading seats and I get to interview him about his forthcoming book, Tim Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation, published by Zondervan. You know, Colin, I've said this often, that 500 years from now, I think maybe two pastors or theologians will be remembered, and I really do believe that Tim Keller is one of those people. The influence that he has had in the 21st century, it really is hard to overstate, from his sermons, his books, his speaking, and his influence in founding TGC, Redeemer Church, Redeemer City to City, just to mention a few. And it's fascinating to me when I travel overseas, not only to see that he's known there, but that he's widely read in a wide variety of theological streams. So it's easy to see that Tim has had influence on many. But in Colin's new book, we get to see who influenced Tim and helped make Tim who he is. So, Colin, I know Tim has had a big influence on you. Can you tell us how exactly he has had an influence on you and how you decided to write this book?
So I got to know Tim in 2007. I was working on my first book, Young Restless Reformed, and I ran up to him at a Gospel Coalition conference. In fact, it was the first Gospel Coalition conference. It was held at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And I was just about to start there as a student, and I said, "Hey, I'm working on this book. I'd like to be interviewed, or I'd like to interview you." And keep in mind, Tim was not a really well-known figure at the time. I'd heard reference to him. Christianity Today had covered him. I think Andy Crouch had written about him, and we knew a lot about him just because of 9/11 and things like that. And maybe I'd heard about a book that was coming out next year. That was The Reason for God. In 2008, he published both The Prodigal God and The Reason for God. And so a big year. Yeah, no doubt about it. So I asked him about this, and he said, "Yeah, I mean, I'm not really interested in doing that interview, but you can send me some questions." So I sent him some questions, and he responded with one-word answers. Thank you, Tim. So I pretty much went ahead with that book without a lot of mention of Tim. And but from there, we actually began to work on a series of books together. And it was a series of books based on different aspects of cultural engagement. We edited a book together by Michael Gerson and Pete Wahnerga called City of Man, about politics. Did a couple more of those as well, culminated in my book Blind Spots in 2015, which is just kind of ripping off some aspects of what Tim has talked about in places like Center Church. And so then also through the Gospel Coalition, we had been working together for a long period of time. But I would say that the number one area that has struck me about Tim from the beginning was the way he articulates the concept of theological vision, and especially the way he lays that out in the Gospel Coalition's foundation documents. I had just never seen anything like that before, Jim. The way that you could have a positive but also critical approach to culture from a theological foundation that would shape your life and your ministry. I just had never seen something like that before, and that was the number one area. And then I think, Jim, I was just the right age, because mentioned right there in the seminary, you've got his first two books come out, and then it has just been a parade of hits since then. Center Church comes out when I'm early at TGC and early in ministry, and everything else, Meaning of Marriage, in 2012, and I remember that was when I was living out in New York City area, and then we brought we used some of Timothy Keller's advice for a friend of ours who was living with a man that she was engaged to, but he was not a Christian. She broke up with him on Kathy's advice. I mean, there was just all kinds of things, and so much of my ministry since my mid-20s has been against the backdrop of Tim's publishing and just the rise of the Gospel Coalition, and so it's been a major influence. I think certainly the biggest influence on my life.
Well, with your proximity to Keller over the years, being a formative figure in your life, the things you talked about, founding the organization that you've given so much of your life to,
right.
How did you prevent this book from being a hagiography that is an overly idealized perspective of Tim?
Well, a lot of ways that'll be in the judge of the readers to figure out if I was able to avoid that. But I had a lot of good help from Tim himself, but then also especially from his friends and his colleagues. And I remember one colleague in particular. She was an important member early on at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and she would alternate between crying with thankfulness for Tim's ministry and everything that he had taught and shown her about the Lord. And then as soon as she could see me feverishly taking notes about what she was saying, she would turn right around and say, "But don't you dare make him out to be a saint. Don't you dare do that. He made a lot of mistakes. We were really angry at him." And that was because she had been on staff at the church as well. And so I would say one of the more kind of pointed aspects of the book relates to some of Tim's struggles as a manager. And so the reason I say that I had Tim's help is because Tim just doesn't cast himself as somebody who's above the grace that he proclaims. He talks about he doesn't like conflict. He tends toward people pleasing, and I think a lot of us can relate with that.
Sure.
But and he's very clear. I mean, he told me in the book that he's not a very good leader. I say in the book that that's not correct. He is a good leader. He just isn't a good manager. But I've spent, Jim, most of my career around pretty successful pastors, and not many of them are good managers. Beyond that, just nobody's good at everything. And so I just always had that perspective. And I also got some help from another one of Tim's colleagues who said to me that the people who are closest to Tim don't idolize him. The people who are most prone to do that are the ones who are kind of listening to him or reading him at a distance. Yeah. And that didn't mean that the people close to him have a negative view. They just see him as a human being, and one that they deeply admire, but as a human being. I think it also helps a lot to know Tim and Kathy together, because that's when you truly understand both of them, is when they're together, and it's just very human. They're just a couple, and they work through things, and you'll have some interesting conversations with both of them when you're talking. So So I hope the book is written from that people can sense my appreciation and in many ways my debt to Tim. But my job as the writer was to present his story on his terms, especially through the perspective of those people who influenced him. So in many ways, the book is not always me assessing Tim. It's just talking with Tim about, say, his mentor, Ed Clowney, or about Barbara Boyd, who taught him to read the Bible. So that's another reason the book, I hope, avoids that hagiography, because it's not necessarily just a book about Tim.
Well, I will say, I think you accomplished what you set out to do in both regards, but the first one and not over idealizing him, because it was really, and I did love the book. So I enjoyed that. I'm not paid to say that. I really did enjoy that. And in the early years in Redeemer, as they grew, you write about the frustrations the staff had, and what we talked about it in one of our staff meetings. Just what got them through that, though, was Tim's character. Yeah. As frustrated as people were, his character caused them to stay by him. Yeah. And you explain how that worked itself out in the book. All right, so most listeners, they're aware of Tim's current health issues, I would assume. Would you be able to give us a recent update on how he's doing health-wise?
Yeah, sure. So there was a sense of urgency that came with this project back in 2020, because that was the year Tim turned 70, but it was also the year that, and when the world shut down, and also when he got his diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. Now, from the beginning, we knew that this was a fairly early detection, but pancreatic cancer is still pancreatic cancer. There is a 100% death rate from it. And I would say that the amazing thing is, while Tim has been unavailable at different times and has had one massive health scare in the middle of that, otherwise the treatments have been, they've been very effective. I mean, where he is right now is just, I don't know how you could be more positive about somebody with pancreatic cancer, and he's going through some experimental treatments, and hopefully those will work, and hopefully they'll be the kind of treatments that the rest of us get someday when we're faced with a similar situation. So he's blessed by many people praying for him. The Lord has been kind in that regard. He's been blessed with really good medical care, even through the pandemic, which of course complicates everything when you imagine being afflicted with something as serious as pancreatic cancer, but as the world is trying to deal with this amazing pandemic, so devastating pandemic. So I would just say that our hope is that the Lord will continue to provide many years with Tim, and thankfully that seems more plausible now than it did when we first just heard those dreaded words of pancreatic cancer.
Well, praise God for that. Yeah. Colin, I know you've done a lot of research on this book. People may just assume you gleaned it as you went, but I've texted with you late at night. You're listening to Clowney lectures. I mean, you've done a ton of research. What, in all that research, what surprised you the most about Tim Keller and his influences?
Yeah. Well, I've got to give a shout out here. There's no way you can succeed in these endeavors without the help of some providential helps. And I'll cite two people in particular for that, and hopefully tease enough of the book so that people want to go check it out for themselves. I got to thank Louise Midwood. Louise was one of the classmates of both Tim and Kathy at Gordon Conwell. She sent me a packet of documents from that early period, and I'll just say that we're going to learn some interesting new things about the origins of Table Talk magazine from that section. So that was I'm not sure, Jim. Hardly anybody knew what I had uncovered there, and it only pieced together because I had just read the newly published biography of R.C. Sproul, and then I got this packet from Louise Midwood, and I'm looking here, and I can't believe my eyes, and I chased down the story, and I'll just kind of leave it there for readers to pick up themselves. But the other person I want to give a shout out.
Let me even say, I live in Orlando, Florida. You know, RC was here, Ligonier's here, and I had never heard what you learned in that book.
I'm not sure they had, Jim. I mean, we're gonna find that out. I'm not sure they had known this part of the story. So for me, as writing a lot of history, that's one of those moments that you look back on and say, "Huh, wow, that might be a genuinely new contribution to our understanding." People a lot of people just don't know the connections between the Kellers and the Sproul's, that R.C. had actually officiated their wedding. And that they had participated at Ligonier Valley Study Center, which is near Pittsburgh, which is where Tim's family had moved from Allentown and where Kathy grew up. And so there were a lot of those connections in there. That was back in the kind of the counterculture days of Ligonier Valley Study Center. So, but then connected to that, I think the other person that I owe so much to is Craig Ellis, Tim's assistant. And I would say, Jim, that the emotional climax of the book, at least for me, is the death of Tim's only brother, Billy, in 1998. And naturally, I wanted to know if Tim had preached his brother's funeral. He had. And I wanted to know what he had to say. And Tim could not recall, at least what he'd had. I mean, he said, I think there is a recording of it, but I don't know where it is. But thankfully, I got the manuscript notes from Craig. And yeah, I'll leave that to people to see. But the question I love to ask, Jim, is what message do you think Tim Keller preached at his younger brother's funeral? And just kind of let that sit with people. And so I'll leave it with the listeners there to mull that over and check it out in the book and see what he preached.
Well, I won't spoil the answer to that, but it was an emotional section and lots about Tim's family that I had never known, and it was neat to see God work in the midst of it. Mm-hmm. All right. As I said, I read the book. One thing that moved me, and maybe convicted me is a better way to say it, is Tim's heart for and his dependence on prayer. And you especially see this in the early years of Redeemer. What things moved you or convicted you as you worked on this project?
Well, let's just stick on that theme. You see it as a consistent theme throughout Tim's life, and you could add that later on with Tim's earlier bout with prostate cancer, as well as Kathy's struggles with Crohn's disease. And you see that around that September 11th period, they were both in bad health. They were burned out because of the trauma and all the aftermath of 9/11. The church was in rough shape. Now, they'd lost a lot of money as a result of the recession in New York after the attacks. And you've seen this has come up in their writings, but they talk about how prayer is like taking a pill that keeps you alive. If you knew that you had to do this to survive, you wouldn't miss it. And so that became the anchor of their own prayer life together. Seeking the Lord together every single night, no exceptions.
Even if they weren't together.
Even if they weren't together. So that was a significant part as well. But I loved what Kathy, I know, Jim, this was part of the book that stood out to you as well, but there's a lot about Kathy in here. People are she is the most significant influence on his life. And people are going to learn a lot in there. And I just loved what Kathy said about her early prayer letters for Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and she describes them as the whiniest, most pathetic prayer letters ever written in the history of missionaries about being a mom to 3 boys in New York. And she said all these Presbyterian women felt so bad for her and were so glad they weren't in her situation. They'd send her $5 to take the boys to McDonald's. But I love how Kathy comes back and says there has been no church plant in the history of the church that has been prayed over more, and especially by women, than Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And she says, if you really want to know how to start a successful megachurch, find out where God is already working a revival and then move there, a month later, or a month before, I think is what she said. And that just speaks to their sense that for all the hard work and all the vision and all the planning, in the end, only God could give that growth. And God gave that growth through the means of corporate prayer. And so I think that's a good theme, Jim. That's a convicting one for me as well, as somebody who doesn't describe myself as a real natural when it comes to prayer.
Well, let's stick with Kathy for a little bit, because I finished reading your book, And I found myself hoping your next project would be a biography of her.
That would be fun.
I didn't know much about Kathy to begin with.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm not going to spoil too much, but I can't. She had a written correspondence with C.S. Lewis as a 12-year-old because she just wanted to encourage what she thought was an old, washed-up author. She had no idea how big he was. And so as a 12-year-old, she was consuming C.S. Lewis, writing C.S. Lewis. You talk about a lot of other things about her, and because she is the greatest influence in her husband's life. So did you know much of her story before starting this project? And if not, what did you learn along the way?
I did. So Kathy and I have worked together for almost as long as Tim and I have. She's spoken at a number of Gospel Coalition events, especially our women's conferences. She's written book reviews for us. She's written essays for us on raising children in the city. She's written one of the most important articles in TGC's history about why you should not marry an unbeliever. And Kathy is one of the most capable writers. I mean, she's a professional editor, not only on Tim's works and a co-author with him on some of his books, but then also previously worked as a book editor in Philadelphia. So that's a lot of Kathy's background. She was a student, got an MA, while Tim got an MDiv at Gordon Conwell. And she is. I think the best perspective I got from her about her was from Liz Kaufman. Dick Kaufman was the executive pastor at Redeemer in the 1990s and was really the person that was supposed to, like Dick and Liz were supposed to plant that church in New York City and were providentially hindered from doing so. Didn't feel a release to be able to do it. It was a surprise situation there. But and Dick unfortunately now has dementia, so I couldn't talk with him, but I was able to talk with Liz. And Liz said that people don't understand that Tim has had an editor inside his head this entire time. And that's Kathy. And that's not just his books, of course, that's also his sermons. And Kathy has never been shy to point out when she thinks that Tim has fallen short on something or missed something. And then we talk about the old one of R.C. Sproul's favorite things to do at Ligonier Valley Study Center were the Gab Fests, all hours of night talks. And Tim and Kathy would do that as well, especially when they moved to Hopewell, Virginia. And Kathy would participate in those, answering questions. And one of the parts that stood out to me, Jim, was the comment from John Guest, who amazingly is still with us as a longtime Episcopal priest and a revivalist and evangelist. And John Guest says that Kathy Christie, now Keller, is the greatest youth organizer in Western Pennsylvania. And but I think when you put it all together and say what kind of woman is corresponding, one of the last people to correspond with C.S. Lewis, who travels to the kilns the year after he dies, as a young teenager, and then goes on to be this force of nature as a youth organizer for churches, for ministries there, and then goes on to Gordon Conwell. I think I wouldn't be surprised, Jim, if the primary takeaway of the book about Tim Keller is for people to really see and understand the unique influence of Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about, she was really the one, if I remember correctly, when they were deciding whether to plant Redeemer in New York, she was the one that said, well, we need to do it. And she had I can't remember exactly how she said it.
Well, it was one of my favorite parts of the book, and there are many things I just didn't know. I mean, you asked Jim earlier about just how I've known Tim. I mean, I've worked closely with them for a long time, and there were most of the things I think in this book I didn't know before I started working on it. And so, Kathy, the main reason Tim had said, at least publicly, that he wasn't interested in the church is that he was worried about Kathy and the boys. And she just didn't want to leave. She just didn't want just didn't want to be in New York and have to raise those boys. Her thought was, what am I supposed to do? Tell them to go play in the street? Like, I don't have any options here. And Tim comes back at one point and he says, well, I think Kathy, we just can't go. And I think it's because, I can't do that to you. And classic Kathy. Classic Kathy gets mad at him and demands that he step up as the leader. So
that's right.
Like, I'm gonna deal. She's like, "Don't you make the decision, and I will deal with the Lord. You make the decision. You're the husband. You're the leader. You make the decision. I'll deal with the Lord." And she did at Jack Miller's church in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. And she was released, and she was prepared to go. But it's definitely one of my favorite parts of the book. That's just a good example of their dynamic. That Kathy is that Tim is very concerned for her, trying to take care of her. That she pushes back and says, be a man, take the lead, make the decision. I'll take it up with the Lord. I love it.
Well, you mentioned Hopewell. This is not a part of Tim's story that I was very familiar with. You think of Tim Keller, New York City, reaching cities, but I think it was 9 years in rural Hopewell, Virginia, right?
75 to 84. That's right. Well, it's south of. It's semi-rural. It's south of Petersburg. Or Richmond, I should say, kind of that Richmond-Petersburg area. But yeah, so semi-rural, an industry town, put it that way, an old DuPont industry town.
So his formations are you have on one, you have the academia, but then you also have this church where he's preaching, 3 sermons a week, and he's doing all the visitations on the edge of burnout, and that part of the story that you told and the ways that it formed him, I think is really relatable to a lot of pastors around the country. So it was just interesting to see the wide variety of
1,500 sermons preached there. Wow. 1,500 sermons that he preached in those 9 years. And I'll just give you one anecdote from that. Was talking with Bruce Henderson, who was the best man at their wedding, Tim's best friend in college. And I was asking him about the move to Hopewell from Gordon Conwell, and because obviously they're very young, and you're moving into a church on a 3-month appointment in a congregation that has only 2 college graduates who are both elementary school teachers, and where most of the members did not complete their education beyond the 6th grade. Okay. That's the context back there in the 1970s, 75. And I asked Bruce about that, and he said, yeah, Tim called me and was asking me some questions, and obviously didn't get paid very much. And Bruce says, yeah, they wouldn't have made a strong impression. And I'm just thinking, well, yeah, I'm sure the church, they must have been desperate, I think is what he said. And I said, well, yeah, Tim and Kathy were actually studying to be postal workers training to be postal workers because they couldn't get hired in a church. Keep in mind, they had become Presbyterian. They were wanting to do the PCA. They were complementarians, male leadership, and they were in New England. And the PCA was brand new 5 years earlier. So there weren't options for them. They didn't have any connections in the South. So they just didn't know that they had any options there. And Bruce says, yeah, they must have been desperate. And I said, yeah, of course Tim and Kathy were desperate. He said, no, the church must have been desperate. He says, I don't think Tim would have made a strong impression on them. That's one of the things that Tim has grown a lot over time. And I think Tim and Kathy both were not exactly the most social, kind of social elite out there, but that part of ministry was a way that they definitely grew. They grew together, they grew individually, and grew to be prepared for the ministry that they would go on to do together.
Well, that's another area I feel like you give us a real picture of Tim, the Kellers. I think in one place you refer to him I guess it was at Gordon Conwell as a little more of a wallflower. a little less likely to walk into a room and take it over. And so we have that Tim Keller, we have the Hopewell Tim Keller, the New York City Tim Keller, the Gospel Coalition Tim Keller, all the same Tim Keller in very different settings. You look at all that Tim has, all the ways the Lord has used Tim, would be the best way to say it. What do you think Tim's lasting legacy 100 years from now will be?
It's a great question, Jim. So I think you could go two directions on that. Most of the time when the Lord continues to perpetuate the legacy of one of his servants, it seems to be through their writing. Now, we're in a whole new ball game with the internet, so who knows with sermons that you can watch and listen to so easily. But usually it's through the writings. The books endure. And I mean, these are books that manage to be both timely but also with timeless truth. There's a real tri-perspectival dynamic to Tim's writing. The situational for that cultural moment, the normative of its biblical and theological treatments, as well as the existential, which is really the ability he has to preach to the heart. There's a lot of counseling influence, David Powlison, CCEF, on Tim as well. So I think for those reasons, the books, though they are written for a moment, at the same time really have a long-lasting effect, and they continue to sell well, even now in some cases, like with The Reason for God, about 14 years after publication. But I would say there is another dynamic here, and this will be harder to know how it plays out. But I mentioned in there that someday when the New York Times does an obituary of Tim, the lead is going to be about his work of engaging evangelicals in global cities. There's just no doubt in my mind that is the singular difference that he's made, which is most evident in Manhattan. When he starts Redeemer Presbyterian Church, I was able to identify, I think, 4 other evangelical congregations in that city that in the 19th century had been the Protestant and evangelical capital of the United States. Still activity in the boroughs, of course, but I'm talking there about Manhattan. And at least 4 that people knew about and talked about. So just to see that transformation in New York City, but then through city to city, and then through his books, you mentioned there, the translations that have been just voluminous in so many different languages. I mean, I think that's the legacy ultimately. Now, maybe there could be reversals on that, but if you're visiting a global city and find a church that is both familiar but also contextual, then you probably, as you're thanking God, thank him for Tim Keller. I'm not saying that he's the only person who was involved in that. The whole point of the book is talking and honoring people like Terry Geiger and his help in founding City to City, and talking about Harvey Kahn and that vision of urban theology. But Tim has definitely been the catalyst used by God for that, and I think that's most likely to be the long-term legacy.
Well, I mean, I think you're right, and you would know better than most. One of the things that stuck out to me by the end, it was just really neat to see Redeemer and TGC come about, and how all the influences played out. And Tim, in his humility, would say, "Oh, well, I mean, that's not new. That's so and so, and I got that from so and so, and I got that from so and so." And you do a good job of showing, well, yeah, but when you brought the best of all these people together, it became something new.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that I think is the ultimate takeaway, Jim, of the book, is that many of us have been a little bit distracted from Tim's influence because he is so quick to credit people. And I go back, Jim, to a lovely scene, and this is, once again, thanks to Louise Midwood. And she described how at Gordon Conwell they'd take classes together, and the students would all sit in the lectures, and then they would go back together to Tim's dorm room on campus, and he would redo the lecture in a way that was somehow faithful to the professor's intent, but somehow with a twist that made it even more insightful. And I just found that to be the ultimate paradigm for Tim. Is no, it's not original. If it were original, it wouldn't be orthodox. But it's original in a way that you hadn't really thought about before. It's original and fresh. And that freshness is a wave of the Spirit, encouraging you, challenging you, convicting you. And that's, I think, hopefully something, Jim, that you and I and other ministers can emulate.
Well said. Thank you for your work on this project.